Will Goldstein here, thekingscourt.com. Again, there's always a chance to subscribe down there by hitting that corner, by hitting that little button. It'll help more people know about the videos and more people to come. And again, I'm a musician. You can always check out music at thekingscourt.com or the main page for my YouTube channel. There's lots of 12 links there. It'll show you everything about my songbooks and where you can listen to digital albums and all that good stuff. So now we're on C.S. Lewis again, continuing this series, Mere Christianity. This is in book 4, number 7. He calls it Let's Pretend. I'm changing the title to almost the same thing, Pretense, the First Steps to God. He starts off by mentioning two stories that are familiar to our minds. One of the stories is Beauty and the Beast, and in that story, the girl, she marries a monster, and she kissed him as if he were a real man, and then of course he turns into a man, and then all went well. And the other story that he wants to mention is about someone who had to wear a mask, and this made him look much nicer than he was in reality, and he wore this mask for years. And then finally, when he took it off, his own face had grown to fit the mask, and he was now very handsome. What began really as disguise ultimately became a reality. So now he wants to talk about putting this sort of idea into practice, and what difference does theology really make in our understanding of God. Then he proceeds to the Lord's Prayer, and he starts up by saying the first words in the Lord's Prayer are Our Father. He immediately says, well, by saying that, you are putting yourself in the place of a son of God. Then he goes on to say, well, you're pretending, because in reality, and in a certain sense, you're not really truly a son of God. You are not a being that is really that much like the true Son of God, and who in his status is really at one with his Father. And yet we are a bundle of self-centered fears with hopes and greeds and the jealousies that we have and self-conceit, and rather than having eternal life like the true Son of God, we are doomed to death. So how much we really like the true Son of God. And then he says the odd thing about this whole thing is that Christ has ordered us to do just that, to pretend as if we are sons of God. Some people might say, oh, what is the good of pretending to be something that in reality you really are not? And then he addresses that by saying there are two kinds of pretending. And there's a bad kind that is pretense instead of the real thing, when a man pretends to help another person, but then he doesn't really help that person. That's the bad kind. But there's also a good kind, and that's when pretense leads up to the real thing. So in other words, he gives an example of, you're not feeling particularly in a friendly mood, but you know that because other people around you ought to be, so then the best thing to do is to put on your friendly face and pretend as if you are. And just behave that way, and actually after a few minutes you might actually feel like you really feel that way. And very often the only way to get a quality into your life is to behave as if you actually had that quality already. So the moment you realize, here I am pretending to be like Christ, at that very moment this sort of pretense could make it a little bit more of a reality. You're getting a little closer to what Christ is really like. And so what is happening is Christ, the Son of God, who is also a man, the Son of Man, like and very much like us, but he is also the Son of God, very much like and as his Father, like his Father. And he's at your side, and he's beginning to turn your pretense into a reality. So you're no longer thinking simply about right and wrong. You're trying to catch a good infection from a person, and that person is obviously Christ. And then he says it's really more like a painting of a portrait, and rather than obeying just a set of rules. And then he says, in one way, pretending to be like another person is harder than keeping a set of rules, but in another way, it's far easier. The real Son of God is at your side to help you, and he's beginning to turn you into the same kind of being as himself. And he's sort of injecting his kind of life and his kind of thinking, his Zoe mentality or spirituality into you. He works in all sorts of ways, through nature, through our own bodies, through books, through experiences. He uses all of those, but above all, he works on us through each other, through our friends and families and interactions. So men are like mirrors or carriers of Christ, and sometimes even they're unconscious carriers. And good infection can be carried by those who have not got it in themselves even. But usually it's those who know him that bring Christ to others. That is why the whole body of Christians showing Christ to one another, that's why that is really so important. It's a reflection. They can see a little bit of Christ in you, and that helps them to become a little bit more like Christ as well. So it is natural for us to see the man who helps us without seeing Christ behind him. We just see the man helping us. But in reality, it might be the Christ in that man that is really helping you. They're working together to help you. Human beings often let us down. Even the best human beings are going to make mistakes. And we should be thankful to people who have helped us and honor them and love them. But even though that's true, we should never pin our whole faith on them. Christians talk about being born again and putting on Christ, and Christ being formed in us, or our coming to have the mind of Christ. Christians mean there's a real person, Christ, and he's here and now, and he's in the very room where you perhaps are saying your prayers, and he is acting and doing things inside you. He's a living man, just like we are living men, just as much as you, he says. But still, he's just as much God, and that is because he created the world. What he's reflecting to is that the pre-incarnate Christ created the world, okay, who is with God the Father from the beginning. And it's that pre-incarnate Christ that actually became incarnate in Jesus. And that is the entity that created the world, is what he's saying, and that's based on Scripture. He's really coming inside you, and he has a mission, and that mission is to put to death the old self and to replace it with a new kind of self. At first, it's only for a few moments where you feel that change in your heart, but the longer that you do it, it becomes more and more, and eventually it becomes more like a permanent changing into a little Christ. So you get closer and closer, becoming more and more like Christ. And Christ wants to share that same kind of life with you, the life that he has as God, and he wants to pass on to you and share his power and his knowledge and his eternity. And soon we will begin to notice, when we have that kind of relationship with Christ, we'll begin to notice how far we are really off the mark, and that we notice our sinfulness. We notice what we really truly are, because the light is shining on the darkness within us. So now we at least see what we ought to be, but we also see what we truly are indeed. When I come to my evening prayers, then C.S. Lewis says I try to reckon up the sins of the day, and the most obvious ones. And then he says about his own sins, well, these, at least for him, are sins against charity. And then he talks about how he sulked or snapped back at other people. These are the obvious ones. He sneered, or he snubbed someone, or he stormed out of the room because he wasn't happy about what happened. And then all the excuses go through his mind about he was provoked, and it was all came on so unexpected, and this is why this happened. And he says that I was caught off guard, and these are really all just excuses. Because at the end of the day, surely what a man does when he is taken off his guard is the best evidence for what sort of man he truly is. So he says what pops out before the man has time to put on some sort of disguise, that is really the truth. So he's talking about impulsive reactions. The suddenness of the provocation shows me what an ill-tempered man I am, C.S. Lewis says. And then he talks about the resentment and vindictiveness that's in the cellar of my soul. And that cellar is out of reach of my conscious will. And I can some extent control my acts, but then he says I really don't have any control over my temperament. That's just really who I am. So what we are matters more than what we do, and what we do is evidence of what we are, and it follows that the change I most need is a change that my voluntary efforts cannot bring about. And this applies to good intentions as well. How many were done for the right motive, and how many for fear of public opinion or desire to show off? I cannot, by moral effort, give myself new motives. This is just who I am. In reality, in the Christian life, we realize that everything needs to be done, and our souls really can only be done by God, the important things. In reality, it is God who does everything. We allow it to be done to us. That we do. We allow it to be done to us. That's our part in it, and to work along with this, and with some degree of human effort to go along with it as well. God sees before him a self-centered, greedy, grumbling, rebellious human being. And then he says to himself, well, let's pretend that this is our son, and that he is like Christ as far as Christ was a man, and he's like him in the spirit. Let us pretend in order to make this sort of pretense into a reality. So God looks at you as if you were really a little Christ. Christ is standing beside you to turn you into one. And then he says, the higher really always raises the lower. Then he gives some examples. A mother teaches her baby, and what does she do? She talks to the baby as if the baby understood, and then, what do you know? Eventually the baby actually does understand. Then he gives an illustration of dogs, and he says, well, we treat dogs as if they're almost human. I see people talking to their dogs all the time. I live in an area that used to be called Dogtown, or Dog River, before it was Hood River. And but because people talk to their dogs, that is why they really become almost human in the end.